this question comes from Heidi. I am seeing a quote by a man named Aaron Ra circulated a lot lately on Facebook, and I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts on it. And Aaron Ra is a internet atheist, just in case you don't know that, Greg. Here's what he says. Nobody reads the Bible more literally than atheists because we don't have to make up BS excuses for when it says something we can't allow it to mean.
Okay. Well, the difficulty here is just the devil's in the details, right? So, and also this question of literally. And so I address this in Street Smarts because it comes up a lot, and that is, I say always do this and never do this. So with regards to the Bible and the chapter in the Bible, never read a Bible verse. We talk about that. But always do this. Always read the Bible, in a certain sense, the regular way. When people say, do you take the Bible literally? Of course, the answer is simply, I take it in the sense that I think the author intended. Do you take the sports page literally? Do you take? I mean, there you got all these people stomping and destroying and, mutilating and doing all these other things. Yeah, crushing. So, no, these are all figures of speech. And, of course, it's not just the sports page that uses hyperbole like that for the sake of effect, but you also have the rest of the newspaper. It has those kinds of things. They have figures of speech. And so we take these, we try to take the text in the sense that is intended, okay? So, but I know maybe part of what this atheist is referring to. Okay, let's just say slavery in the Bible. Look at all the slavery in the Bible. So I read that literally. Really? If you read it literally, you'd know that the word translated slave is abad, and abad means servant. It's the exact same word in both cases. And up until about the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, it was always translated servant. And then it started being translated slave, and now you have slave translated, the word about translated slave. Okay, so are you taking that into consideration? When you think slavery, when you read slavery, you take it as a literal characterization of the kind of thing that happened in America. But that is not what the writers intended. And when you read the text and all the things that are involved with it, you realize it was quite different than that situation. All right? So part of the difficulty is his point, reading literally, okay? Now, what about the axe head that floated? Do you take that literally? Yeah, because that's the way it was written. This is something miraculous that happened. And so what's interesting is a lot of times when people say, do you take that literally, what they mean is, do you take the parts of the Bible that I don't like at face value? Like, the flood destroying all humankind at that time, the world that then was, as Peter puts it in 2 Peter, or Jesus being the only way of salvation, Jesus being the God-man, Jesus raising somebody from the dead, healing lepers, rising from the dead himself. You don't take all that literally. That's not rational. What do you mean that's not rational? Well, what they mean is it doesn't comport with a rationalistic, materialistic philosophy they're bringing to the text. There's nothing irrational about someone coming to life again after having died if there is a God who is the author of life and then can accomplish miracles. One person put it this way, I think it was Frank Turek, that everybody believes that the universe had a beginning. Secularists and Christians, they all believe that. Christians think God did it. Oh, that's a miracle. What do you believe? The whole universe came out of nothing spontaneously for no reason and no purpose. And that's not a miracle. That's just a miracle without God. So both sides is committed to a miracle of some sort. All right. So the irony to me is that when other miracles show up in the Bible, these are dismissed out of hand as not being literal. When it appears in the context that these things are describing events that the writers were fully convinced took place. Now, it doesn't mean you don't have to assess these. I'm I'm just making the observation that when the atheist says, I read it carefully and more literally than others, that needs to be cashed out. What exactly does he mean by that? Okay, our classical question. And also, he mentioned about BS excuses. Well, I think there may be excuses that are baloney like that, and that happens. That doesn't mean that there isn't a legitimate explanation for that from somebody who's not talking baloney. All right, and like my comment about slavery. Well, wait a minute. This is servanthood in many cases, if not most cases, and even when it's the kind of slavery and not just servanthood, indentured servanthood, it wasn't the kind of slavery you have in mind anyway, because the Mosaic Law was like union representation to those who were in servitude. It all comes down to the details. I would want to hear more of what he says. What I just offered wasn't a BS excuse. What I just offered was an explanation of the historical context of the ancient Near East, and that it was the law of Moses that dignified servants and slaves, if you will, far beyond anything else in the ancient Near East. That helped them. So that's the kind of thing that has to be taken into consideration when you hear statements like this.
It's also in the context of the main thing that happens in the Old Testament is the rescue from slavery. Mm-hmm. Clearly, God does not want people to be in slavery. That's not his ideal. Mm-hmm. That's not what he wants. And this brings me to the topic of context. And here is where I think things go wrong quickly with a lot of internet atheists. There's a whole context to these verses, these passages. And so sometimes what they will do is read one verse and say, this means whatever. One example that I've run into before is they think God commanded God commanded
Abraham.
the Israelites to do child sacrifice. Mm-hmm. Now, if you look at the context, this is clearly not the case, and I've made the case on our website if you look up child sacrifice at str.org. But a lot of times, what happens when I point out the context is they will say, no, this is what this verse says, and you're denying what this verse says. And here's where I think maybe you could illustrate with another book, because we all know how to read books. Yeah. So if there's some sort of a novel that everybody knows, maybe something from Harry Potter, just have it ready and say, okay, what does this sentence mean? Take something that out of context means something crazy and horrible, and then say, what does this mean? Is this promoting, lying or whatever? But then if they know the story, they know that's not the case. Mm-hmm. So you can point out, look, when you just read this one passage, then it sounds like this. But that's not reading it literally, as you were pointing out, Greg. You have to read everything in context, and it's the context that makes sense of that sentence. And it's not illegitimate to bring the context into the situation. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times there are a lot of atheists who will get these, verses here and there on the internet, and then they think they've got a slam dunk, but they really don't know what the context is for that verse.
I heard a great example of this from David Wood, who was talking about Abraham being sacrificed, and this is Abraham sacrificing his son, or being asked to sacrifice his son. And so he gave a whole bunch of the historical background to it, and then showed that all things considered, when you look at the entire account and understand the ancient Near Eastern practices that where child sacrifice was prevalent, as an example of showing the most fealty to the God you worshipped, which is why these other pagan religions would do that. It was their way of showing fealty to God. They sacrificed what they loved most. Abraham was being asked to do that, to show his great love for his God in a way that made sense within the context of the culture. Then God stayed his hand to show that child sacrifice is not appropriate. Okay, and so what happens is the exact opposite message is communicated when you understand the full context than what atheists or critics take from the passage when they read just this narrow thing. There are also other indications that Isaac is not going to be sacrificed because Abraham says to his servant, we're going to go up the mountain and we will return. Okay, and then when Isaac asks about where's the sacrifice, Abraham says God will provide the sacrifice. And even in the book of Romans, Paul says that Abraham understood this was the child of promise. So if it turned out that he was sacrificed, God would raise him from the dead because the promise was in the seed of this son of his, who had to survive in order for that to happen. When you see all of that all those particulars there, it sheds an entirely different light on the sacrifice. And one last thing I'll mention, though, and it's something that happened on the show many years ago when I was working at KBRT, and somebody called in on an issue like this. Then he was an atheist, and he disagreed with me, and he said, this is blah, 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 and this is his view as he read it. And I said, well, I don't think that's what's happening. Here's, I think, what's happening. He said, well, that's just your interpretation. That's not my interpretation. I said, okay, well, then the problem is with your interpretation. It's not with me. You have an objection against your own interpretation, so you have to solve that problem. Mine doesn't have that problem, and you have to deal with me and my views if you're going to bring objections against Christianity.
Well, that's the thing. We all know how to read books. There are certain rules of interpretation that we all understand, even if we've never studied it. And you can study it when it comes to the Bible. It's called hermeneutics, and you learn about the context, the history, the genre, how to make sense of things. But the fact is, we can use our minds to show what is happening in a passage. So if they're willing to look at it, you could just say, look, let me make my case, and you tell me where I've gone wrong. And then, you can tell me if this is just an excuse. Now, it may be that they'll reject whatever you say, but then you can say, okay, I think I've made a reasonable explanation of this, and we just disagree on that.
There's an alternate explanation that's legitimate that doesn't fall prey to your objection. That's basically what you're saying.